Hey guys, what's up? This is What the Tech, and this right here is Apple's brand new redesigned M2 MacBook Air, and it's redesigned Midnight Glory. Can you see all the fingerprints I have on it already? Don't worry, there'll be plenty more where that comes from. But first, let's check it out. Right off the bat, we're going to start with the design, and this is a pretty contentious area to be honest with you. The M2 MacBook Air enjoyed a generational redesign with a more flat unibody look. This styling places the Air aesthetically more in line with its more capable Pro siblings, the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro. With this redesign, we unfortunately lose the iconic wedge shape that the Air was always known for, and with that gone, you will be missed. I don't like the loss of the wedge because I always saw that as part of its airy character, but oh well. Still, it has a nice unibody aluminum build, and it's a pretty strong chassis too, almost no flex unless you're really trying to abuse it. The display part of the laptop was redesigned as well. It's a top-notch design. The bezels were minimized, just like the Pro, and it gives it more of a modern vibe. That's something you honestly learn to ignore, and I'll talk about it up front now. A lot of the UI elements of macOS go either on the far left or far right on the top toolbar, and you rarely will have a time where that notch actually cuts anything out, but when it does, it is pretty jarring. Even though you have a phone that probably has a notch, seeing something that big on a laptop, it's something you have to get used to, but I do promise you, it does melt away into the background. I'll give Apple credit for one thing, its laptops are definitely iconic now. Iconic with that big old Apple logo in front, or now with their awesome redesign, the cutout in front, or the back. So, in the front of a classroom, you see the logo, and from behind someone's shoulder, you'll see the notch. Righto, in terms of I/O, we have two USB-C ports on the left, one MagSafe right on top of it, which is great, and surprisingly, one 3.5mm headphone jack on the right side. Okay, now let's talk about actually using it. If the M1 MacBook Air was a revolutionary, industry-defying, bar-setting overachiever, then the M2 MacBook Air is a pretty decent successor. Okay, now let's say the M1 was like Sam Raimi's 2002 original Spider-Man, then the M2 is the 2004 Spider-Man 2. Pretty good sequel, checks all the marks you want to check in order to make a decent or pretty good follow-up. It just doesn't live up to the hype or jump over the shadow cast by the original. And that's what the M2 MacBook Air is to me, the Spider-Man 2 of MacBook Airs. Okay, so dated movie references aside, the MacBook Air was actually a treat to use. The model I have here is the base model version, so that's the one with 256GB of internal storage, 8-core CPU, 8-core GPU, 16-core neural engine, and 8 paltry gigabytes of RAM. More on that later. When it came to doing everyday normal tasks such as watching videos online, being a media consumption machine, surfing the interwebs, online shopping, and the occasional video call for personal or for other reasons, it can take it on fairly easily. Light multitasking such as playing videos picture-in-picture while scrolling through the web were handled just fine, especially if you're using Safari or Google Chrome, surprisingly. Where it did slow down was rendering a lot of content when doing, for example, a lot of research and you have lots of tabs in the background with your word processor up and center. Using around the house or taking out to the real world was something I could do confidently without needing to worry about being near a charger or take one with me on the go. The battery life on this thing is pretty good with 8 to 10 hours of active usage with around 12 of light on the touch usage. When using the machine outdoors, it handled it alright. It's rated at 500 nits peak brightness, but if your display is directly facing the sun, it's going to get washed out. If you're under a patio setting, you're going to be fine, and it's going to be great when used indoors. The integrated Touch ID sensor is very consistent and pretty bone dead simple to use. It makes managing your passwords across the interwebs a lot easier, if you're into that kind of stuff. I kind of wish there was Face ID on Apple's laptops instead of Touch ID, because especially with this wedge here, this notch, there's ample room for a flood illuminator. Face ID, or something similar like Windows Hello, is really convenient because once you open up your laptop, it just logs you in. You don't have to move your hand. That's amazing. That's a level of convenience that I hope Apple adopts in the future. This is how the webcam and microphone is. It's pretty good for a laptop, but this is how it is under ideal lighting. And this is how it looks without my light setups on. So still pretty good, and this is what you're probably going to see most of the time. The keyboard experience is something I can happily report is quite uneventful. It works, and it just works well. We celebrate yet another year we're further away from the dreaded butterfly switches. The display for consuming content is pretty good too. I enjoyed watching movies and videos on it because the UI actively hides a notch as much as possible. If you're one of those types that uses their laptop to watch movies, this will treat you well. The speakers were great too, especially for listening to music in a room, or if you need to put something up loud as you did dishes. I always do the dishwashing test. And one of the interesting notes is that the speakers on this year's MacBook Air actually isn't on the side anymore. It's now integrated between the display and the keyboard. So design choice there. It doesn't really dampen the sound experience, but you're not gonna get that huge bass thumping experience you get on the Pro models, which I think you shouldn't be chasing in a laptop anyways. Being the second generation of Apple's ARM-based Apple Silicon, there are more apps than ever that could run natively on Apple Silicon. 3 apps that just come to mind that recently came out, or the last couple months, is Dropbox, OneDrive, and Minecraft. Obviously, one of those is a lot more important than the other. Which one you choose is up to you. And with Apple one step closer in completely eliminating Intel from its lineup, we can see that the transition has been going well. And if you're still hesitant today on whether or not it's the right time to pick up a Apple Silicon laptop, I can say for the vast majority of things you're gonna be using this for, you're gonna be plenty okay, because Apple does have the market share, small, but it's a very money spending happy base that developers will transition for you. Rosetta 2 is still an excellent translation layer for running things that still are just Intel x86 based or universal. Now, with all the good stuff said and done, let's talk about the bad. Some things I didn't really like about using the MacBook Air. First thing to mention is the overall price jump. Yes, I know inflation is something that is worth mentioning because historically we haven't seen inflation jump up this high in, well, historical terms in quite a long time. But right now we're experiencing a maelstrom of perfect events that keep pushing the ledger to increasing the prices. To pay 200 more bucks to upgrade your RAM from the paltry 8 gigabytes to a, in my opinion, acceptable 16 gigs, or to pay 200 to increase your storage from 256 to half a terabyte of internal storage, that's extortion almost. Most people when they buy a laptop, especially an Apple one, they kind of expect it to last for half a decade. But the issue is, when you're spending $1,200 for 8 gigs of RAM, I can't recommend that. It's just not gonna last well. Because I feel like in Apple's ideal world, where an Apple employee expects people to only use Apple apps, that could probably work, maybe, you're cutting it close. But in the real world, we use apps that aren't just fully designed and made from Apple. We use things such as Teams, Zoom, Microsoft Word, Excel. Those are big, clunky apps, and that's gonna eat up a lot of RAM, and you're gonna notice it pretty quickly, I'd say. If you round back the clock almost a decade, or even just half a decade, I'd say 8 gigabytes would have been okay if you're an average user, but if you're seriously thinking about getting a new laptop in 2022, going 2023, you need to start at 16 gigs. You really are kneecapping yourself if you stick with 8 gigs of RAM, in my opinion. The M2 chip itself, I don't question it. It serves me really well. It's officially around 15 to 30% faster than the outgoing model. I think 18% for CPU and 30% for GPU. I'll put a graph up here. I trust it. Additional $100 for a slight upgrade. That's fine, that's good. It's those other internals that just doesn't make sense. Another con to report is that this does honestly get a little warm, especially when you try taxing it heavily with multitasking activities. And I don't know if that's an issue of me having just 8 gigabytes of RAM, so it's working a little harder for what it's got, but with no active cooling mechanism, once it gets hotter, right, it's gonna just naturally slow down all the processes I have. So the only way you could actually cool down the machine is go to a cool environment, walk out into snow, or just slow down your workload, because that's definitely not annoying. Another issue, and this might be small or really big, so I didn't know where to put this, but to me it's big, to others it may be a non-issue, is that the M2, much like its M1, or exactly like the M1, can't natively support outputting 2 displays. Via the Thunderbolt 4 USB 4 ports here, it can, with one USB-C cable, output to one external display. But if you want to do 2, it just can't do that. Now there are workarounds. I think there is something called DisplayLink. I actually just recently helped my friend set up a DisplayLink setup with her M1 MacBook Air. It was a little more kludgy than I expected. It wasn't as graceful, and you do have to invest a little more than you'd expect onto a nice USB-C hub setup. It's not for everyone. Maybe people don't want 2 external monitors, but when you start accepting the reality that more and more people are doing work from home, it might be something you just have to take seriously. And if you are thinking about working from home, 2 monitors is a massive productivity upgrade. And if you need 2 monitors, all of a sudden you cross out M1 and M2. These are just the harsh realities here. If you need 2 monitors, you just automatically wipe this off your list of potential laptops you can choose from. I don't know why Apple doesn't think its MacBook Air consumers need the extra productivity from 2 monitors. I personally believe that the M2 was gonna get that fixed, but it just didn't. I'm disappointed, and you should be too. Minor point, remember how I said MagSafe is back? That's really cool. I like that. Nothing wrong there. It's these 2 USB-C ports here. One, I wish they were both on opposing sides. So one USB-C here, and then one USB-C here with the one headphone jack on top. It's really nice to actually be able to charge any direction you want from left or right. It's a nice convenience. You don't always have to charge via MagSafe. You most likely will, but if you're out and about, universal charger being USB-C, it's nice to have. Another issue is if you have, hang on, I might have it here actually. If you have 2 USB-C flash drives, right? And you have 2 USB-C ports, sometimes they don't actually fit because they're too close. This one's a little chubbier than this one. I plug this one in here. It's blocking this one from going in here. It's also blocking a potential charger. Actually, to be honest with you, it might be blocking MagSafe. I'll check that in a bit with another video. So I ideally would like both USB-C ports on opposing sides, or if I have to deal with it being on one side because of a controller switch or something, I'd want it a little more down. It's not wedge shaped anymore, so there has to be more room, right? Apple? I guess that's about it for cons. My biggest gripe is that Apple's charging way too much for upgrades of internals. It's very transparent too. We see it in the iPad Air lineup, or the iPad lineup. They want to get you to a point where once you add 1, or better yet 2 upgrades, you're already at the doormat for the MacBook Pro with how pricing works. You might as well upgrade to the MacBook Pro, which has a higher average selling price. It's very unfortunate, it's very transparent, it seems very nickel and dimey, to be honest with you. There is almost no reason why you should get 24 gigabytes of RAM here. It makes no sense for an Air, and especially at that point, you should just get the Pro, because then you can support 2 monitors to boot. Okay, with all that said and done, where does this leave us? The M2 MacBook Air exists in a very competitive landscape right now. More competitive when the M1 came out. AMD's offerings on the desktop side of things have seen such great success that OEMs are a lot more comfortable now picking those mobile processors and applying them in their laptop lineup. They're honestly great alternatives in Windows land. But if you're the kind of person where you narrowed it down, you did the research, and you're pretty sure you want a Mac, let it be because you have an iPhone, an Apple Watch, an iPad, you're knee-deep in the Apple ecosystem, and you kind of just wanted an Apple computer because that's what you always expected and no one's going to change you, then the MacBook Air is good. But which MacBook now? Because you know you don't want to spend enough for the Pro, but you know you need some kind of laptop that's going to be dependable, last for a long time. I cannot recommend this at base model. You could do a lot of things, tasky things one at a time would be well. I hate using the word future-proofing, but 8 gigs of RAM is just not gonna last. I think by 2024, you're gonna hate having 8 gigabytes of RAM. So I would recommend an upgrade. And if you're okay with 16 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage, then this is fine. Because something you have to factor, and this may be vain, I understand and I accept that. The midnight color is a value to some people. I have friends, believe it or not, they really like the midnight color. They sing a lot of praise of it. I think it's very pretty too. You just saw a video on it. I'm sure you've seen many pictures of it. But if you value that stuff, then go ahead and get it. But if you're already thinking about upgrading a MacBook Air to 16 gigs of RAM and half a terabyte of storage, let me show you to another competitive offering that's also Apple, the M1 MacBook Air. It is objectively slower than the M2, but the issue is, or maybe the lack of an issue because Apple made such a great first generation chip, is that for most day-to-day tasks, you won't notice it. It opens apps really quickly. You can surf the web really quickly. Safari opens like that, Google like that. The only thing that slows YouTube down is your internet. You'll be fine. If you're doing light media manipulations such as pictures, oh, super easy. Doing video editing, maybe it'll render slow, but it can handle it pretty well, especially if it's Apple's native apps such as iMovie or Final Cut Pro. The M1 MacBook Air really is the best competitor to the M2 because it starts still in a very aggressive price point of $1,000, and if you have an education discount, that's $899 prior to tax. Yeah, you're gonna be missing out on that sweet, beautiful midnight color, but you got the wedge shape, and plus just throw a skin on it. So that's where we stand today, guys. The M2 MacBook Air exists pretty awkwardly in Apple's lineup because the M1 still exists, and when you price up the M2 to what I believe is a decent option, you're so close in pricing parity to the MacBook Pro 14-inch that you might as well throw in the extra bucks to jump to an actual MacBook Pro and support 2 monitors, which you probably may need in the future. Apple never said they'll make it easy, and I think that's the whole point. They want you really contemplating on that pricing ladder. Do I step down or do I step up? Or do I compromise? But right now, what I can say is the M2 MacBook Air is a pretty good follow-up. It's everything you'd expect from a sequel. Some letdowns here and there. You get the Pro look with Pro Lite pricing, but if you get Pro Lite pricing, you're gonna pay down the road, that's for sure. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one, and hopefully the next one might come a little more regularly. Peace.